Margaret Chase Smith was raised in the small town of Swahegan, Maine. Because her family was relatively poor, she was never able to go to college. In 1930, Margaret married Clyde Smith, a local politician. After his death in 1940, Margaret took over his position in the U.S. House of Representatives. By the time her career was over, the woman who once desired to be a PE teacher would become a pioneer for women in national politics and reform the nation's conscience by following her own. Margaret Chase Smith was an extraordinary woman. She was the first senator to stand up against McCarthyism, the first woman in the Republican or Democratic parties to run for president, and takes credit for paving the way for women in politics today.
She actually winds up going in the Senate, first in the House of Representatives in 1940, and then in the Senate in 1948. So altogether she serves 32 years in Congress, and she's really the first woman who's able to take that new right of women being able to vote and run for office and turn it into a career.
After World War II, countries began to be overthrown by communism. It wasn't long before all of America was afraid of being overthrown by communism.
On June 1st, 1950, in which she stood up in the Senate and gave a speech that became known as her Declaration of Conscience speech. And what she was responding to was what had begun happening in this country beginning in February of 1950 when Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had started to go around the country waving pieces of paper saying he had proof that there were communists in our government. And people were very concerned about that, as was Margaret Chase Smith, but what she very quickly realized is that he really didn't have proof that there were communists in our government. What he had was lots of gossip and rumor and innuendo about people. And what she didn't like about McCarthy was the tactics that he used. He was a pretty classic bully, a political demagogue who was just trying to build his own career at the expense of other people. And she thought that those tactics were wrong. So she never mentions him by name in her speech. By criticizing the types of tactics that Joe McCarthy was using, it's very clear who she was speaking out against. The next day, all across the country, the speech is talked about in banner headlines. 11 days later, she's on the cover of Newsweek magazine with the caption down below, Margaret Chase Smith, a woman for vice president, ?
3 weeks after her speech, North Korea invaded South Korea, making the fear of communism in America greater and the will of people to follow McCarthy stronger. As revenge for Senator Smith's speech, McCarthy got her kicked off one of her committees.
And the next time she ran for Senate in Maine in 1954, he handpicked a candidate to run against her. She very easily defeated that candidate, but he did make her life in the Senate miserable. As much as he could. It isn't until 4 years later in 1954 that people start to wake up and realize that Margaret Chase Smith had been right all those many years ago.
McCarthy was voted out of the Senate on December 2nd. He was then very depressed and relied on alcohol, which on May 2nd, 1957, killed him. 7 years later, at a Women's National Press Club meeting, Margaret Chase Smith announced she was running for president.
First, there are those who make the contention that no woman should ever dare to aspire to the White House, that this is a man's world, and that it should be kept that way.
When she makes her announcement speech, she frames it in such a way that she, as she goes through the speech, she is coming to the conclusion, and she lists all these reasons people have told her not to run.
As a woman, I would not have the physical stamina and strength to run. Contended that the odds are too heavily against me for even the most remote chance of victory. I do not have the financial resources to wage the campaign that others have, because I do not have the professional political organization that others have. Absence from Washington while the Senate had roll call votes.
She says for all those reasons, that's why I am going to run. Because she realized that if women always bought into that psychology, a woman would never run. And if a woman never runs, then a woman will never be successful.
Margaret made it all the way to the Republican National Convention. In the first ballot, she got 5th place. Then on the second ballot, when many of the competitors were forfeiting, Margaret refused to. In the second ballot, she placed 2nd.
Wow, because she wanted to be able to say, I came in second. She wanted to lay down that marker for women who came after. She was serving as a role model, not just for young women, but for older women as well, to show them that if they were determined, they really could accomplish things at a time when, again, women didn't have all the rights and opportunities that we take for granted today.
Shortly after the Clintons moved into the White House, Hillary Clinton was asked by Parade magazine to write a list of her role models. One of the people she singled out was none other than Margaret Chase Smith. Even if she didn't win, she still inspired many other women thereafter to run for president.
What really makes her stand out is that she was a very determined person. To know what Margaret was going to do, the easiest way was to tell her she couldn't do something, and then you knew she'd try to do it.
Altogether, Margaret Chase Smith led the United States out of the Red Scare and left a legacy of paving the way for women in politics today. Papa knew Mrs. Smith. He had the utmost respect for her. She was a woman who was not afraid of hard work, taking risks, and planning for the future. She did not push forward without knowing what she needed to know. A great role model.